several years ago, one of my favorite singer-songwriters, a guy by the name of Mark Hurd, had an album, called "The Eye of the Storm," and of course, the title song of the album, has this really nice driving acoustic feel. It's just a nice, kind of feeling song. But the last word of the chorus is kind of haunting. He says, "Out in the eye of the storm, the friends of God suffer no permanent harm." And are you hearing how he's careful with his words? He doesn't promise us that we will not suffer harm, and of course, neither does Jesus. But he does promise us that in the eye of the storm, the power of God is sufficient for our storms, whether he calms the storm or whether he leads us, through the storm. It is awesome and powerful as a storm can be for us. It is far more foreboding in the ancient, Hebrew kind of mind. If you look at Hebrew literature, the Hebrew writers are not afraid, to ascribe to storms out in the open sea, mythical power. Isaiah, writes, on that day, and he's speaking of the day when God will right all wrongs. On that day, with his relentless, large, strong sword, he will bring judgment on Leviathan, the fleeing serpent Leviathan, the twisting serpent. He will slay the monster that lives in the depths of the sea. And then, of course, we have, that scene in Revelation where, "And I saw a beast coming up out of the sea. It had 10 horns and 7 heads. On its horns were 10 crowns. On its heads were blasphemous names that were written." And then, of course, in the Hebrew mind, creation itself is portrayed as a taming, of the waters. So that opening line in Genesis, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." Now, the earth was formless and empty, void and empty, wild and spacious. Darkness covered the surface of the watery deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the surface of the waters. And then, of course, he continues, "And God said, let there be an expanse between the waters, separating water from water." So he made the expanse and separated water underneath the expanse from the water above the expanse. And it was so. And then he says, "Let the water under the sky be gathered in one place, and let dry land appear." And it was so. God called the dry land earth, and the gathering of the water he called seas. And God saw everything that he had done, and he said, "It is good." And then, of course, we move into, chapter 6 and 7, and God brings judgment. And as he brings judgment on the world, it's kind of a devolution of these initial acts of, creation. When you read the account, it's kind of rich. It says, "In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, on the 17th day of the month, on that day, all the sources of the vast watery deep burst open. The floodgates of the sky were open, and the rain fell on the earth 40 days and 40 nights. And so you have kind of this act of decreation where the boundaries that God had set for creation are violated in the same way that the boundaries he had set for us are violated. David can use this kind of image when he talks about his personal enemies pursuing him. He said, "Oh Lord, do not let me fall into the miry deep. Do not let the waters overcome me. Rescue me from the source, of the deep." And then, of course, you have that description of Jonah when he's been cast over the side of the boat. You cannot get more vivid than the Hebrew that you find in the book of Jonah. And you just kind of feel it. It said, "When you threw me into the depths, into the heart of the seas, and the current overcame me, all your breakers and your billows, they swept over me. The water engulfed me up to my neck. The water depths overcame me. Seaweed was wrapped around my head. I sank to the very foundations of the mountain. The earth gate shut behind me forever." You almost feel claustrophobic when you read that, don't you? Sensation of falling, being up to your neck, and then, of course, being overcome and falling to the very depths of the sea, seaweed wrapping around you. You can just kind of feel the confinement that he's feeling, when he comes, in the middle of this. And then there's a very curious passage for us. It's that final and climactic scene in Scripture, Revelation, 21. "Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and there was no more sea." And that kind of, leaves us scratching our heads a little bit because a lot of us head to the coast. We like to get beachside condos. We like to, kind of leave the windows open at night so we can feel the gentle lapping of the waves up on the shore, and it just kind of lulls us, to sleep. So, for us to go into the new heavens and the new earth and say there are no seascapes, it's hard for us to even imagine, a picture of tranquility. But for the Hebrew mind, it's saying all chaos is done away with. All the devastating power of nature has been subdued. All of the disruptive forces that have been against us in so many ways and so many different times, they are no more. And so that is a Hebrew, picture of tranquility. And of course, you need to see all of that as you look at the calming of the seas. You see all of that against that Hebrew background. Nothing more fearful than a raging sea. So we begin in verse 1. Jesus and his disciples go to the other side of the lake, or verse 22. It says, one day Jesus said to the disciples, "Let us go to the other side of the lake." This has theological significance. They're not just looking for a change of scenery. They've been in the area of Galilee. Most of Galilee is in Jewish territory. It's described by Josephus, in glowing terms. The waters are deep. The waters are, clear. There was, crops, 10 months out of the year. And it's just a lively population and just kind of a cool place to be, a cool place to hang out. You can imagine the Sermon on the Mount overlooking the Sea of Galilee and all of those, kind of interesting, kind of things that you get. But there would be one spot on the far shore of Galilee that takes you out of the familiar Jewish territory and into Gentile territory. And of course, in that you begin to see that the gospel is exceeding its boundaries. The gospel is going to new places. And of course, that'll set us up for, what we're going to encounter, a little bit, next week. Jesus gets in the back of the boat. And by the way, Luke covers this with the least amount of detail. Mark gives us the most detail when he covers, this event. Luke covers it with the least amount of detail, but the way that Luke covers it brings it down to a pinpoint focus. In verse 23, it says, as they sailed, he fell asleep. Mark tells us he fell asleep on a cushion in the back of the boat, tells us exactly where he was, exactly, what he's doing. And then it says a squall came down on the lake so that the boat was being swamped, and they were in great danger. On the eastern shore, you have these huge mountainous kind of cliffs over the Sea of Galilee. And it kind of conceals the weather patterns that are coming in behind. And the weather patterns are being formed, off of Mount Hermon, which is, 10,000 foot high peak. The Sea of Galilee is 700 feet below sea level. And all of a sudden, the cold air clashing with the warm air, and you could have these incredible and almost hurricane force winds that would rip across that lake and would rip across the lake, without a moment's notice. And so, the word that he's using here, this violent storm has overtaken him. And the language in the original is a little bit different than the way it comes off, in our translation here. It doesn't really say so that the boat was being swamped. It says so that they were being. And the word is an interesting word. It's used for, sometimes in a very positive way for things that are flowing over the top, God's abundance in our life. But when you're in a boat, when you're in the middle of the sea, when a squall comes over the eastern, this is not comforting for things to be coming over the top. So it's not really saying the boat was being swamped. Really what it's saying is they were being overwhelmed. You have, those images from the Old Testament that they feel the impending doom of what is happening, there. You shouldn't miss, and probably as the gospel writers are writing this, they're thinking about this. In the moment, the disciples are not thinking about this, but you have a pretty nice image there, and the image is a beautiful contrast. You have Jesus sleeping in the middle of a storm, and of course in Mark, the disciples say to him, "Don't you even care? I mean, how can you sleep through this when we're in deep danger?" But you have this picture of Jesus sleeping in the middle of a storm and the disciples panicking in the middle of the storm. And as the gospel writers are writing this, they're probably just kind of, chuckling to themselves, the contrast. Obviously, when you're in the middle of a storm, you never chuckle to yourself. But when you look back at your panic, you often do. And they probably recall the idea of rest, which is a promise of hope that God has given to us. David, writes in Psalms 33, Lord, how many of my foes, how many rise up against me? Many are saying of me, his God will not deliver him, but you, Lord, are a shield around me, my glory, the one who lifts my head. What a great image. Have you ever had a little child come to you in shame for something they've done? And then you simply reach over your hand and you pull their chin up so that they can see you and feel the grace that you have for them and the love, that you have for them. He is the one who lifts my head high. I call out to the Lord and he answers me from his holy mountain. I lie down and sleep. I wake up again because the Lord sustains me. I will not fear though 10,000 assail me on every side. Psalm 4:8. In peace I will lie down and sleep, for you alone, Lord, make me dwell in safety. One of my favorites, Psalm 127, 1 and 2. Unless the Lord builds a house, the builders labor in vain. Unless the Lord watches over the city, the guards stand watch in vain. In vain you. And of course this takes us back to the image, of the weeds, doesn't it? The seed that fell on the weeds that's choked out by the worries and the pleasures and the pressures of this world. In vain, you rise up early and you stay up late, toiling for food to eat, for he grants sleep to those he loves. The Hebrew you can translate, in two different ways. He gives rest to his people because they have a quiet confidence in him. Isaiah says, you'll keep in perfect peace him whose mind is stayed on you. And it's that kind of, image. But the other way you could translate this is, for the Lord gives to those he loves, even while they sleep. In other words, even though we rest, he doesn't rest. And his grace is continually poured out on us, in those very moments. So you have this incredible contrast. You have the disciples panicking. You have Jesus at rest. In verse 24, the disciples went and they woke him, saying, Master, this is it. We're going to drown. He got up and he rebuked the wind and the raging waters, and the storm subsided and all was calm. I don't know what the scariest water event you've ever been in is, but if you've ever been caught, out on a small craft in the middle, of a lake, and you've had something, like this happen, you can kind of, be intimidated by everything that's going on. And even if you kind of wait it out, you pull up on shore and you wait it out a little bit. When the wind dies, the seas don't automatically die, with the wind. It's kind of a low process. And what happens here is you have something pretty incredible. He speaks to the wind and the waves like he is, speaking. He's rebuked a fever. He's rebuked a demon. Now he's rebuking the wind and waves. He's speaking to them, like you would have firm correction, to a small child. He's not doing anything, that's kind of extraordinary. He's not kind of rolling up his sleeves and kind of, leaning back and putting a lot of power into it. He doesn't reach for a wand. He doesn't have an incantation. He just kind of gets up in the moment and he speaks to them. In Mark, it's just be still and be quiet. And that's all, he says. And he speaks to them. And not only do they stop, but there's an eerie calm on the water. And so the calm must have been every bit as scary as the storm. Sometimes you find yourself in immediate quiet and it overcomes you. You find yourself in the storm and it overcomes you. And this is an event, that on every side just has this incredible impact. And of course, as you see him doing this, again, you're drawn back to the Old Testament. Again, you're drawn back to the Psalms. Psalm 89, who is like you, Lord God Almighty? You, Lord, are the mighty, and you, Lord, are mighty, and your faithfulness surrounds you. You rule over the surging sea. When it waves mount up, you still them. Here's one of my favorite. Matter of fact, this was my COVID verse. When everybody's doing this kind of, what do we do with this? And this, I kept reminding myself, God is our refuge and strength and ever-present help in time of trouble. Therefore, we will not fear. Love this line. Though the earth gives way and the mountains fall into the heart of the sea, whatever is happening around us, it wasn't quite this. And the fact that you may have to wear a mask for a little while, or the fact that you really don't know what's happening, or the fact that everybody's telling you different stories and people are acting in different ways, and it's just kind of a weirdness factor of all of this, and everybody's kind of panicking. Even though the earth gives way and the mountains fall into the heart of the sea, though its waters roar and foam and the mountains grow and quake with their surging, that we can rest and hope in Him, in the deepest of the storms. The passage ends with two really important questions. As a matter of fact, the questions answer themselves. The first question, is Jesus' question, to the disciples. And Jesus' question to the disciples is, where's your faith? The disciples' question of Jesus is, who then is this? And of course, when you've answered the first question, or the second question, the first question automatically answers itself, in a sense. So when we've gone through the Gospel of Luke, the Gospel of Luke 4 times, Jesus will commend people for extraordinary faith. The first time, of course, is whenever, the 4 friends lower their friend on a mat in front of Jesus, so that he can be healed. And Jesus looks back up at him and said, your faith has made him well, which is kind of an incredible, kind of thing. And then the second one is where the centurion comes to him and asks, can you heal my son? And as Jesus is in process, going to heal his son, the centurion says, you don't even need to come into my house. I just know you can say the word, and if you say the word, it'll be done. And Jesus in that moment looks around, at those who are following me and said, I haven't found anything that looks anything like this in Israel. Here's a man of great faith later on in this chapter. We see a woman that kind of, sneaks through a crowd. Her condition renders her unclean. She shouldn't have been in the crowd in the first place. She sneaks through the crowd. She touches the hem of Jesus' garment, and there's a healing power that, comes from him, and he's healed, and Jesus stops. Said, who was it that touched me? And the disciples are going, Lord, gosh. Everybody's kind of pressing in and touching her. And he finds her, and he looks at her, and he says, daughter, your faith has made you well. And then, of course, you'll have the moment, in the temple when Jesus is watching all the people, go by the treasury, and they're dropping, their gifts in the treasury. And as they're dropping their gifts in the treasury, another aged woman, slips up and with 2 little small, pieces of copper, really the kind of copper you put in the palm of your hand, and in a second you wouldn't even register its weight. It's just 2 little copper shavings. Puts it in. Said to the disciples, come here. Did you see that? And obviously the disciples thought he was talking about all the ostentatious gifts that had gone before. Did you see her? And everybody else put in out of their abundance. She gave all that she had and commends her for his faith. The interesting thing is, in the gospel, you never find faith where you should find it. Every time he speaks, to the disciples, it's not congratulating them because, they have found faith. It's saying, how have you been with me so long? How have you experienced me, to this point? How have you seen my teaching? How have you heard my words? How have you seen my command over, nature? How have you seen my, command over demons? How have you seen all of these things and still you have no confidence in my depth of my love for you and the confidence, that I have, the confidence that you can have in me, in the middle of the storm. And of course, Luke wants us to hear that question as well. He's not just writing, to the disciples who were in a really hairy moment on a boat. He's writing to us as well. Where is your faith and where is your confidence? And of course, faith is more, and the gospel is more, than just that. It brings us into a relationship with God. The reality of the gospel, the power of God being sufficient for the very deepest needs of our life and the most pressing needs of our life, also being more than abundantly powerful for every situation in our life. So when we talk about, the power of Jesus, we come to one of the biggest questions that, a lot of us ask, and it really goes back to, Mark and the way the disciples wake him and rouse him as he's sleeping on the cushion and say, "Don't you even care?" Here I am, being overwhelmed. I feel like I'm up to my neck. I feel like it's over my head. I feel like I'm sinking into the depth to be remembered no more. Here I am, experiencing, all of this, difficulty, and it seems to me you must be asleep. Do you really care? Don't you care, Lord? I'm drowning here. And that kind of takes us back, to a little tune, referenced at the beginning. Out in the eye of the storm, the friends of God suffer no permanent harm. And the promise is not that harm will not touch you. And the promise is not that tragedy will not touch you. Matter of fact, we have, the reverse, guarantee in Scripture that we will face, the tragedies of this world, and we will face trials that sometimes, feel overcoming, and we will face difficulties that are beyond, our explanatory powers. Lord, I have no idea what you're doing. So when we trust God and the power of God, we're not trusting God for an outcome that we would like. We're trusting God in spite of the outcome. One of the nicest examples, of this kind of faith is, you go back, to the exile and, those 4 young Jewish men, who were brought into Nebuchadnezzar's palace. Daniel, Azariah, Mishael. And they're there, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, according to the popular kids' tune. They receive, different names, and they're placed in that. And of course, there is this, image that's erected on the plain of Ono. And just for a single day, whenever the lute and the lyre and the zither, all the instruments, start playing, you're to stop right there in your tracks and bow down to the image. And then, of course, everybody is saying, those that you've given high places in your kingdom, they're not bowing down, to your image. And Nebuchadnezzar's furious. And he brings them into his presence and says, I'm going to give you one more chance. Strike up the lute and the lyre and the zither, and you can bow down. I said, we're not going to. And here's this nice little statement of faith. The God whom we serve is more than able to rescue us from this moment, but even if he does not, still we will not bow. And so faith in God is, more than simply trusting him to calm the waves in our life. It's trusting him in many instances to take us through the waves. And it's trusting him in a deep way. And, and I've been your pastor through, these last years, and I've witnessed, some of the suffering, that's happened, in your life. And, I always console myself with the thought that God has promised, that there is no, temptation or testing that seized us is not, common to man. And when you're tempted, He'll provide a way out. And then his very next phrase is one that's a little bit haunting, so that you can stand up underneath it. And so I see the things that that you experience in my life, to this point has been largely untouched, by tragedy. And I see the things that, some of you have experienced, and I see the agony, that some of your loved ones have gone through, and I see the depth of the questions that rise, as you maybe have a little kid, crying out to the Lord, or, you have loss after loss after loss, and you can't really explain, what's going on there. And the only comfort, I have in the moment is that we have a Lord who knows what He is doing in these moments. And His grace is sufficient for those moments. I don't have a quick, ready answer for you in the middle of your suffering. Nor would I want to give you a quick, ready answer for you in the middle of your suffering. But I can point you to someone who will wrap his arms around you and hold you close to himself and deliver you through his suffering. And I can promise you that when you get to the other side and you see his face, he will say, as Paul learned to say, these momentary and light afflictions are producing for us an eternal weight of glory that far outstrips them all. And the fact that we have experienced the storm makes the glory of his presence even more rich. And so we have wonderful gifts, to take us through the storm. We have the confidence of who he is and the power that he has. I love, the two images, they're coming together, nicely, in this. You have, two uncontrollable powers kind of colliding, don't you? You have the uncontrollable wild forces of nature, of which sometimes we'll succumb and sometimes we'll be part of it. And sometimes they will hit us and sometimes they overwhelm us. But you also have the uncontrollable wild power of Jesus. And the reason I say that is because it's not really something we can co-opt, for our purposes, to use in a way that we want to get outcomes that we want to. But it is a power that is greater than any power that comes against us. And we trust not the outcome, we trust the person. And we trust that when Jesus, I don't want to make too much of this, says we're going to get to the other side, we will get to the other side. Now, I love this next part. Here's the disciples asking a question about Jesus. And this is the answer to the first question. In fear and amazement. So far in Luke, we've seen both fear and we've seen amazement. This is where the two collide together. And this is just, something you would naturally experience when you've had an encounter with the living God. You see, first of all, this kind of fear gripping Peter, with the extraordinary catch of fish. Jesus is teaching in the boat, and he looks at Peter and he says, let's throw this thing out just a little bit further and put the nets on the other side. And Peter's going, stay in your lane. You're a great teacher, but I'm a really good fisherman. And they have the catch of fish, and when they have the catch of fish, Peter looks up and says, oh my goodness. There's power at work here that is beyond anything I've ever experienced. And his reaction is the right reaction. It's the one that, Jordan invited us to a while ago. to notice the fear and the awe of the Lord. And then Peter's response is, oh, get away. I'm a sinful man. We've lost that. And we have wonderful grace and familiarity. Oh, what a great gift. The comforting presence of the Lord, but we have to realize, that the comforting presence of the Lord is also the awesome power of the Lord. And so our worship, ought to be drawing near for comfort, but it also be, falling on our face in awe of who He is. And of course, the question is, who is this? And the answer is in the Psalms, because only God can command the winds and the waves. And they're vastly expanding what Messiah is. The few little healing miracles here have already expanded. Their teaching has already expanded. But now they're seeing command over the most awesome forces that they can think of, the powers of nature. And they're going, who is this? We have no categories. And the response is worship. And that brings us to the Lord's table.